Elizabeth Sullivan has always been dismissed by her family as just a struggling consultant, but what they don't know is that she's secretly built an empire that's shaking the foundations of their family business. Her own parents and brother think they have the luxury industry cornered, but Elizabeth's about to reveal a shocking truth. She owns more than they ever imagined. In a single moment, everything will change. Will she finally prove her worth, or will her family destroy her plans? Get ready for a game-changing revelation that no one saw coming. Elizabeth Sullivan stood by the grand window of her penthouse suite, gazing out at the sprawling skyline of Los Angeles, the city that had become the heart of her empire. Her phone buzzed incessantly with updates about her hotels across the globe, luxury resorts, 5-star ratings, and millions in profit. She was the CEO of Sullivan Global, a conglomerate of high-end hotels that stretched from New York to Paris, Tokyo to Dubai. Yet her family, her very own blood, continued to see her as nothing more than a failure. She was an outsider in their eyes, a woman they thought lacked the real hospitality know-how. Her parents, still running Henderson Hotels, had spent years dismissing her ideas. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., had told her point-blank 3 years ago, "This is a family business, Elizabeth. You can't just throw trendy gimmicks at it and expect change. Leave the business to the professionals." That line stung more than it should have, but it wasn't new. She had always been the one they overlooked, the consultant with the grand ideas but no practical experience, according to them. Her brother, Matthew, the supposed golden child, was the heir apparent to Henderson Hotels. To him, Elizabeth was just a footnote in the family's legacy, a failed attempt at something she was never meant to be. Tonight, she was expected to attend another of those tiresome family gatherings, the ones where she'd be forced to smile through clenched teeth as her parents lauded Matthew for his contributions to Henderson Hotels. Contributions that were, as usual, little more than superficial changes. Rebranding the minibar snacks, adding a few pillows to the suites, and slapping a fresh coat of paint on the walls. To her, it felt like the very definition of mediocrity, yet here he was, always the one to receive the praise. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had revolutionized the hotel industry with her innovative ideas. AI-powered guest experiences, sustainable luxury, and personalized services that had generated billions for Sullivan Global. But it wasn't enough. Her parents had dismissed it all, and in their eyes, she would never be a true part of the family business. As she arrived at the event, a gala at Henderson's flagship Beverly Hills property, Elizabeth took a deep breath. The venue was grand, as expected, golden chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings, polished marble floors beneath her feet. But beneath the glittering surface, Elizabeth could feel the familiar sting of rejection. The evening unfolded in a predictable pattern as her parents mingled with industry elites, and Matthew basked in the attention of their well-wishers. The moment she entered the ballroom, a well-dressed attendant greeted her with a tight smile. "Welcome, Miss Sullivan. Your family is expecting you." "Thank you," she replied, forcing a smile as she stepped deeper into the room. It was clear no one here knew what she had truly accomplished. To them, she was just the failure they'd pushed aside. Even her clothes, custom-made, stylish and elegant, felt out of place, like they were part of a persona she was forced to wear to fit into this world. Her parents barely spared her a glance as they spoke to their guests. "Matthew's done wonders for the company," her father was saying, oblivious to the fact that the company's decline had more to do with his own outdated ways than with any real progress Matthew had made. "We've got to keep Henderson Hotels true to its roots." Elizabeth fought the urge to roll her eyes. If only they knew the truth, that the roots they clung to so desperately were the reason the company was losing its edge. She had presented them with cutting-edge ideas for modernizing the hotels, integrating technology, and focusing on luxury that catered to the modern traveller. But they refused. "You don't understand hospitality, Elizabeth," her mother had told her once. "Stick to your little consulting work. Leave the real business to the experts." Tonight, it seemed, was another reminder of just how little they cared. As her parents continued to fawn over Matthew, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel like an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of their perfect little world. It was in that moment, amid the clinking of champagne glasses and polite chatter, that she made a decision. She was done being ignored, done letting them believe that their outdated methods were the key to success. She could feel the weight of their dismissiveness pressing on her shoulders, but rather than breaking her, it fueled her. She had built an empire from scratch. It wasn't a matter of proving her worth anymore. She knew her worth, and it was time for them to realize it too. As she walked past her family, who were so absorbed in their self-congratulatory bubble, Elizabeth allowed herself a small, private smile. They had no idea what was coming. Her success was no longer something she would hide or shrink from. This was her moment, the moment she would take what was rightfully hers, and soon her family would learn just how wrong they had been about her all along. Elizabeth walked through the grand lobby of the Henderson Grand Hotel, the one her parents had spent decades building into the cornerstone of their legacy. The lobby's opulence was undeniable, with its high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors reflecting the glittering lights. Yet to Elizabeth, everything felt stagnant, frozen in time, a relic of the past. She smiled faintly as she passed the front desk, where staff were too busy to notice her. To them, she was just another guest. But in truth, she wasn't just a guest. She had been quietly investing in Henderson hotels for months now, quietly acquiring shares through various shell companies. Her stake was now substantial, just shy of 50%. She had her sights set on the majority, and she wasn't about to stop now. No one in her family had any idea. They still saw her as the failed consultant, the one who never understood how to run a real hotel. As she entered the family's private dining room for the evening's gathering, she heard the familiar, hollow laugh of her father. Michael Sullivan Sr. was telling one of his tired old jokes about how difficult it was to maintain the family business. "It's always been about family," he boasted, his voice filled with pride. Elizabeth stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, but no one seemed to notice. Her mother, Claire Sullivan, glanced up briefly, her gaze dismissive as always. "Ah, Elizabeth, how nice of you to join us," she said with a forced smile, clearly uninterested in anything her daughter had to say. Matthew, her brother, stood beside her, smiling smugly as usual. He was the golden boy, always receiving praise for the most trivial of accomplishments. Tonight, he was the centre of attention again, regaling the family with tales of his latest improvements to the hotel's operations, things like adding new types of snacks to the minibar or switching up the pillow arrangements. To Elizabeth, it was laughable. Her ideas had revolutionised the industry, but here, in this room, she was still the outsider. "Good to see you, Elizabeth," Matthew said with a slight, mocking tone. "Did you bring any new ideas to save the hotel industry tonight?" Elizabeth smiled coldly. "I think the minibar might be getting a little stale. Perhaps you should focus on the bigger picture, Matthew, but I'm sure you've got it covered," she said, her voice laced with just enough sweetness to hide the sting of her words. Matthew's face faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. His pride was his greatest asset, and he couldn't bear to have his ego bruised, especially not in front of their parents. He quickly shifted the conversation, turning it back to his supposed accomplishments. But Elizabeth wasn't paying attention anymore. Her mind was elsewhere, on the plans she had been secretly setting into motion. The family continued to discuss matters of the business, blissfully unaware of the quiet storm that was brewing beneath the surface. Elizabeth's thoughts were focused on the numbers, the figures she had been tracking. She had bought up as much stock as she could, using her vast network of shell companies to remain anonymous. Now she controlled almost 50% of Henderson hotels. The final push was coming soon, but Elizabeth knew she had to bide her time. She had always been patient, always willing to wait for the right moment to strike, and that moment was fast approaching. The room fell into a lull as her father began discussing the upcoming hotel awards ceremony. "We've got a big night ahead," he said, his voice booming. "Matthew will be receiving the award for innovation in hospitality. It's been a long time coming. The industry is starting to recognize his contributions to the company." Elizabeth's stomach churned. Innovation in hospitality? Her brother's innovations were nothing more than window dressing. He had barely scratched the surface of what true innovation looked like in the industry. Meanwhile, her work had led to the integration of AI-driven personalized services, creating luxury experiences that were light years ahead of anything Henderson Hotels had to offer. "Of course, Matthew deserves it," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "but I'm sure that adding new snacks to the minibar really is a game changer." Matthew glared at her, but before he could respond, their father jumped in. "Enough, Elizabeth. It's time you understood that this family business isn't about flashy ideas. It's about tradition. The Sullivan name means something. You wouldn't understand." Elizabeth's heart sank, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she met her father's gaze with a quiet, almost pitying smile. "I understand more than you think, Dad," she said softly. "You just don't see it yet." The evening wore on, with the conversation drifting between trivialities and the same old stories. Elizabeth excused herself as soon as she could, her mind racing. She had long since accepted that her family would never see her for what she truly was, an architect of change, a pioneer, but that didn't matter anymore. She had already made her move. Henderson Hotels was now a part of her empire, and soon they would all see just how wrong they were about her. As she left the room, her phone buzzed with a notification, another update on the progress of her stock purchases. She had crossed the 50% threshold. Soon, the company would be hers. The final pieces were falling into place. The days of being overlooked, dismissed, and ignored were over. Elizabeth was done being the family's shadow. It was time for her to take what was rightfully hers, and the Sullivan family would have to learn to live with it. The memories came rushing back to Elizabeth, flooding her mind like an unstoppable wave. It was almost surreal thinking about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. It had been 5 years ago when she first presented her grand vision for Henderson Hotels. The concept was revolutionary. A seamless blend of luxury and technology, personalized guest experiences powered by artificial intelligence, sustainable practices that would reduce costs while elevating the brand. Her idea was bold, forward-thinking, and it was quickly shot down. She had sat in the family's private conference room, a bright-eyed young consultant full of passion, ready to lay out her ideas in front of her parents and brother. She had prepared for weeks, working tirelessly on a presentation that would prove to them that Henderson Hotels could thrive in the modern world without sacrificing its legacy. She had shown them charts, statistics, projections, every bit of data she could muster to prove her case. But her family wasn't impressed. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his expression stern. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "These ideas of yours, they sound like gimmicks. Luxury hotels don't need artificial intelligence or green initiatives. We've built this company on tradition. This is what the clients expect from us. Elegance, opulence, not this technological nonsense." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had worked so hard for this moment, believing that she could change the direction of the company, believing that they would finally see the potential of her vision. But instead, her father had reduced her ideas to something unworthy of his attention. Her mother, Claire Sullivan, added her voice to the chorus of dismissal. "Honestly, Elizabeth," Claire had said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "you're getting a little too caught up in these trends. This is a family business, not a Silicon Valley startup. You'll never convince the board to go along with this." Matthew, her older brother, had sat back in his chair with that insufferable smirk on his face. He always seemed to enjoy watching Elizabeth be dismissed, as if he were the judge of everything that happened within their family's business. He had never had an original thought in his life, but somehow everyone believed he was the key to Henderson Hotel's future. "Maybe you should stick to your consulting job, Elizabeth," Matthew had said, his voice oozing with condescension. "Leave the real business to the people who know what they're doing." The words stung more than she cared to admit, but they also fueled a fire within her. The idea that her family, the very people who should have supported her, had so readily dismissed her was unbearable. She had always believed that if she could just show them how much potential there was, they would understand. But instead, they saw her as an outsider, a failed attempt at innovation. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth felt the weight of their rejection like an anchor around her heart. Her dreams of taking the Sullivan family name to new heights felt out of reach. She had tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that she didn't need their approval. But deep down, she knew it did. She had spent her entire life seeking their validation, only to realize that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. It wasn't long before she made a decision. She would no longer wait for their approval. She wouldn't allow herself to be bound by their narrow vision of what Henderson Hotels should be. The rejection stung, but it also made her stronger. If they couldn't see her worth, then she would show them. Elizabeth knew she was capable of far more than they gave her credit for. She had started planning in secret, building her own empire in the background. The foundation of Sullivan Global was laid quietly, without her family's knowledge. They continued to see her as the failed consultant, while she turned her expertise into a thriving hotel chain that had been recognized globally. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had built something even bigger than they could ever imagine. The memories of that fateful meeting haunted her, but they also pushed her forward. Every time she thought about the way her father had shut her down, the way her mother had dismissed her, the way Matthew had mocked her, she found herself more determined than ever. She would take back what was rightfully hers. The rejection had been painful, yes, but it had also been the catalyst for everything that came after. And now, as she stood on the precipice of taking control of Henderson Hotels, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It was time for them to realize just how wrong they had been. Elizabeth had learned a hard lesson from that meeting all those years ago. Sometimes the people you love the most can be the ones who hold you back the most. They had tried to keep her in a box, to limit her potential. But now she was breaking free. She wasn't the failure they thought she was. She was the one who would save their legacy, even if they didn't want her to. And soon they would see exactly what she was capable of. Elizabeth sat in her sleek, modern office, staring out at the city below her. The lights of Los Angeles glittered like a sea of stars, but her focus was on the numbers, constantly shifting on her screen, displaying the progress of her quiet takeover. No one, not even her family, knew that she had been steadily purchasing shares of Henderson Hotels through a series of discrete shell companies. She had built a sizable stake, bit by bit, over the past year. It was all part of her plan, a plan she knew would pay off no matter how long it took. The industry had started to take notice. Her name was beginning to surface in discussions with other key players, some of whom had long ago recognized the limitations of the family-run establishments like Henderson. Her innovations in hospitality were no longer dismissed as trivial. They were seen as the future of luxury. The AI-driven systems she had implemented in her hotels had revolutionized guest experiences, and now even industry giants were asking her to collaborate. She smiled to herself. It was all happening just as she had hoped. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, one of her closest advisors. The message was simple. Meeting with a potential partner in 2 hours. They're interested in Sullivan Global's tech solutions. Elizabeth quickly typed a response. I'll be there. The next few hours were spent in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and emails. The wheels of her empire were spinning at full force now. Sullivan Global was no longer just a consultancy firm, it was a game changer. Her hotels were beginning to attract high-profile investors and partners, many of whom had no idea that Elizabeth was also secretly becoming the largest shareholder in Henderson Hotels. While her family continued to live in their own bubble, Elizabeth was building something that would eventually force them to confront her success. They had thought she was a mere consultant, an outsider who didn't understand the business. Now she was quietly pulling the strings behind one of the largest hotel empires in the world. As the day went on, Elizabeth's mind kept drifting back to the past. She remembered the countless times she had tried to present her ideas to her parents and brother, only to be dismissed. But now, those rejections didn't hurt as much. They had fueled her determination, and every setback had become a stepping stone. She had made deals that no one in her family could have imagined, connecting with players in the luxury market across the globe. From Europe to Asia, her hotels were thriving, attracting clients who valued innovation over tradition. And now those same clients were beginning to take notice of the Sullivan Group, not just as a hotel management company, but as a leader in the future of luxury hospitality. One of the largest players in the market, Rafferty Hotels, had recently reached out, expressing interest in Sullivan Global's AI technology. Their CEO had been impressed by Elizabeth's work in revolutionizing the guest experience. Elizabeth couldn't help but smirk. This was exactly the type of validation she had been seeking all along. She wasn't just a consultant anymore, she was a visionary. The negotiations were going smoothly, and Elizabeth was feeling confident. She knew that once Rafferty Hotels officially came on board, it would solidify Sullivan Global's place at the top of the hospitality industry. But there was one more thing she had to do before that could happen. Her plan to take control of Henderson Hotels was nearing its final stages. She had been buying stock under the radar, carefully and methodically, until she had accumulated almost 48% of the company's shares. Once she reached 51%, the company would be hers, and that was just a matter of time. Elizabeth didn't need her family's approval anymore. They had made it clear that they saw her as nothing more than a disappointment. But now it was their turn to be disappointed. They had built a legacy, yes, but they had neglected to evolve with the times, and now that very legacy would be in her hands. As she walked into the meeting with Rafferty Hotels, her mind was focused on the future. The past, the pain of being rejected by her own family, seemed so far away. Elizabeth was no longer the little girl looking for her parents' approval. She was a powerful force in her own right, with the strength and vision to take over an entire industry. Her meeting with Rafferty went exceptionally well, and by the end of the day, Sullivan Global had secured a new partnership that would push her business into an even greater spotlight. But Elizabeth didn't linger on the success. Her eyes were already on the next step in her master plan, the takeover of Henderson Hotels. By the time she returned to her office that night, the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She had successfully acquired 51% of Henderson Hotels. The next morning, she would call the shots. Elizabeth Sullivan was no longer an outsider. She was the queen of the hospitality industry, and it was time for her family to see her for who she truly was. Elizabeth sat at the head of a sleek glass conference table in her high-rise office, overlooking the sprawling city beneath her. Sullivan Global's latest quarterly report had just come in, and the numbers were as impressive as ever. The hotels under her control were thriving, luxurious, tech-driven spaces that catered to a new generation of travellers. Her empire was vast, expanding into every corner of the globe, from New York to Tokyo to London. Yet, despite her undeniable success, Elizabeth had kept her triumphs hidden from her family. They had no idea what she had built. They were still in the dark, believing that she was simply an outsider, a consultant who didn't understand the true heart of the hospitality industry. Her family's perception of her had always been that of a failure. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., never had any faith in her abilities, calling her ideas gimmicks and claiming she wasn't cut out for the hotel business. Her mother, Claire, was no different, brushing off her contributions as too modern for their family's legacy. Matthew, her brother, had always been the favoured one, received praise for insignificant tasks while Elizabeth was relegated to the background. The sting of rejection, the feeling of being the overlooked child, had driven Elizabeth to build an empire in secret. Now, as CEO of Sullivan Global, she was the one calling the shots, the one who was changing the future of luxury hospitality. But none of it mattered to her family. Tonight, the family was gathering for dinner at Henderson Grand, the hotel that had long been a symbol of the Sullivan family's legacy. Elizabeth's parents had invited her, and she had reluctantly agreed. It was the same pattern: dinner, small talk, and the endless praise heaped upon Matthew. But this time, Elizabeth had a plan. It was time to let them see who she had become. She would walk into the family dinner with her head held high, fully aware of her success, even if they had no idea of her accomplishments. As she entered the private dining room, her family was already seated, chatting among themselves. Matthew was the first to notice her. "Oh, look, it's Elizabeth, the consultant who's always busy with her little projects," he said with a mocking smile. Elizabeth could feel the familiar weight of his condescending tone, the same one he'd used all her life. It never ceased to irk her, but tonight it didn't sting as much. She had learned to let his words slide off her, knowing that he was still blissfully unaware of just how much power she held. Her parents barely acknowledged her as she took her seat. Claire offered her a polite nod, but quickly turned her attention back to Matthew, hanging on his every word. Michael Sr. barely looked up from his menu. It was the same routine, the same disregard for her presence. Elizabeth felt the isolation she had grown accustomed to, but now it was different. Now she knew exactly what she was capable of, and no amount of their coldness could shake her confidence. Dinner began, and the conversation drifted to the state of Henderson hotels. Matthew, as expected, was the focal point, eagerly recounting how he'd reorganized the minibar offerings and streamlined room service menus to increase profits by a modest amount. Elizabeth couldn't help but roll her eyes, but she remained composed. "So, Elizabeth," Matthew said, leaning back in his chair, "have you made any progress with your little hotel projects? Still working on that tiny little consultancy of yours?" He said it with such feigned politeness that it almost made her sick. Elizabeth met his gaze and smiled sweetly, her tone calm. "I'm making quite a bit of progress, actually. While you're rearranging snack options, I'm leading the most innovative hotel chain in the world," she replied, her voice smooth but edged with quiet confidence. Matthew's face faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, laughing off her comment. Right. You're the one who's always so eager to change the game." "Well, maybe one day you'll realize that the real success is in tradition, in sticking with what works," he said, his words dripping with smugness. The familiar frustration bubbled up inside Elizabeth, but she swallowed it down. She didn't need to prove herself to him anymore. The industry knew who she was. She had already revolutionized the luxury hospitality sector with technology, sustainability, and personalized experiences. She was light years ahead of Henderson Hotels and their outdated ways. But her family, particularly Matthew, still refused to see it. Claire, overhearing the exchange, decided to intervene. "Matthew's right, Elizabeth," she said, looking up from her wine glass. "We've always been about providing the best service in a traditional manner. These modern ideas of yours are a passing trend, and they'll fade away soon enough." The words hit Elizabeth like a slap in the face. The sting of rejection from her mother, someone who should have been her biggest supporter, cut deeper than any of Matthew's words. But instead of reacting, Elizabeth calmly took a sip of her wine and looked around the table. Her parents' unshakable belief in their old ways had blinded them to the world around them, to the opportunities they were losing while the world was changing. "Maybe," Elizabeth said slowly, her voice steady, "the trend is just what Henderson Hotels needs to stay relevant. If you refuse to change, you'll be left behind." "I'm not the one who's going to fade away, Mom. You should be worried about your business, not me." There was a brief silence at the table, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Elizabeth knew she had made her point, but there was no immediate acknowledgement from her family. Her mother looked away, and Matthew simply picked up his fork, pretending to ignore her. It was the same old routine: dismissal, mockery, and rejection. But Elizabeth wasn't the same person she had been all those years ago. The years of silence, the years of feeling invisible, had built her into something stronger. She didn't need her family's approval anymore. They had their business, and she had hers. But soon they would realize that the future of Henderson Hotels lay in her hands. Elizabeth sat in her office, staring at the glowing screen in front of her. The numbers danced across her tablet, the steady increase in her stock ownership in Henderson Hotels. At this point, she controlled nearly 50% of the company. It was a delicate balance. If anyone discovered her actions, it could cause a storm, but that was the risk she was willing to take. She had spent the last several months carefully acquiring shares through various channels, moving in silence as the family business slowly slipped into her hands. Each step, each purchase, had been calculated with precision. Her strategy was working. Soon she would control enough of Henderson to make her the majority shareholder, and then there would be no stopping her. However, Elizabeth knew that even with the power she now held, it wasn't enough. She still had to prove her worth to her family. They had dismissed her for so long, rejecting her ideas, mocking her vision. They saw her as a failure, someone who couldn't fit into their world of tradition and legacy. Despite the success she had built with Sullivan Global, the company that was now a leader in the luxury hospitality industry, her family continued to treat her like an outsider. And no matter how much she achieved, that sting of being ignored by the people she loved, the people she had always sought approval from, never fully went away. Later that week, Elizabeth found herself face to face with Matthew. He had requested a private meeting with her, and though she had expected it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The conversation that was about to unfold had been rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare her for the dismissal she was about to face. They met in a sleek conference room at one of her hotels. The walls were adorned with contemporary art, and the floor-to-ceiling windows provided a sweeping view of the city. As Matthew entered the room, his usual smug smile spread across his face. "Elizabeth," he greeted her, his tone somewhat patronizing, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I imagine you're too busy running your small consultancy." The words stung more than she cared to admit, but Elizabeth kept her composure. She had long since learned not to let him, or anyone else, see her true feelings. "Not at all," she said smoothly, her voice even. "What can I do for you, Matthew?" He leaned back in his chair, the picture of confidence. "I just wanted to talk," he began. "I've been hearing things about Sullivan Global, and to be honest, I'm a little confused. I don't understand why you're so focused on all this high-tech stuff. It's not real hospitality, Elizabeth. You can't just throw some gadgets in a room and call it luxury." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had been through this conversation 100 times in her head. Matthew had always seen the world in a narrow, limited way. His idea of innovation was changing the font on the hotel menus, not transforming the entire guest experience. "Matthew," she said, her voice firm, "luxury is not just about what's on the surface. It's about creating an experience that's meaningful, personalized, and memorable. Technology is a tool, one that's changing the way people interact with the world. If we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." Matthew scoffed. "Adapt? You mean throw away everything that's worked for generations? You really think people want their hotels run by robots and algorithms?" Elizabeth fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had been prepared for his resistance. It was what she expected. He was the product of their father's traditional thinking, someone who couldn't see past what had been done for decades. To him, change was a threat, something that undermined everything the Sullivan family had built. "I'm not asking you to throw away everything, Matthew," Elizabeth said, keeping her voice level. I'm asking you to evolve, to grow, to see the opportunities that technology provides. This isn't about abandoning our legacy. It's about making sure we don't become irrelevant in a world that's constantly changing. Her words seemed to land on deaf ears. Matthew crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, dismissing her as he had done so many times before. "I think you're out of touch, Elizabeth," he said, shaking his head. "You're chasing trends. You always were. You don't understand the business the way I do. We're different, and that's why I'm running Henderson Hotels." There it was again. The dismissal. The assumption that because Elizabeth didn't conform to their narrow view of success, she didn't understand anything. It wasn't the first time he had said something like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But it hurt just as much every time. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her hand gripping the edge of the conference table. She had heard enough. It was clear that nothing she said would change his mind. "Matthew," she said, standing up, "I've heard everything I need to, but know this, you don't own this company. I do, and whether you like it or not, Sullivan Global and everything I've built is the future of luxury hospitality. Your days of running things the old way are numbered." She turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Matthew wouldn't understand, and maybe he never would. But that didn't matter. She was in control now. The family she had once hoped to impress, the family who had cast her aside, soon they would see just how wrong they had been. Elizabeth's mind raced as she walked away from the meeting. The final stage of her plan was already in motion, and the day when she would reveal her true power, her true success, was fast approaching. Elizabeth stood in front of the grand conference table in the boardroom of Henderson Hotels, the place where her family's legacy had been built. She looked around at the familiar faces, her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., sitting at the head of the table with a stern look on his face, her mother Claire seated beside him, and her brother Matthew, who was looking at her with an expression of disdain. Today was the day. Elizabeth had made up her mind. It was time to reveal everything to them. She had put together a comprehensive plan to revitalize Henderson Hotels, and she was determined to share it with the family. After all, it was their company too, even if they didn't realize how much it was slipping away under their traditional, outdated management. For weeks, she had worked tirelessly, refining her ideas, finding ways to merge the legacy of Henderson Hotels with the future of the hospitality industry. She had included AI-driven guest experiences, sustainable practices, personalized services, and a complete overhaul of the outdated infrastructure. She was confident this plan would not only save the company but propel it to new heights, but she knew that her family's response was far from guaranteed. Elizabeth set the papers down in front of them, the plan detailed and clear. She had carefully considered every aspect, from the financials to the timeline, and was ready to defend her vision with every ounce of conviction. "I've spent the last several months developing a strategy to modernize Henderson Hotels," Elizabeth began, her voice steady. "This plan will transform the brand, attract a new generation of luxury clients, and streamline operations with cutting-edge technology. I've already implemented similar strategies in Sullivan Global, and they've been nothing short of revolutionary." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Her father's brow furrowed, and her mother looked disinterested, as usual. Matthew sat with his arms crossed, his lips curling into a thin, mocking smile. "You're wasting your time, Elizabeth," Michael Sullivan Sr. said, breaking the silence. "We've been in this business long enough to know what works. These ideas of yours are nothing more than flashy distractions. The hospitality industry is about tradition, class, and personal service, not this technology-driven nonsense." Elizabeth's heart tightened at his words. She had known he would say this, but it still stung. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself to him, trying to show that she understood the business better than he thought. Yet here he was again, dismissing everything she had worked so hard to accomplish. "You're wrong, Dad," Elizabeth replied, her voice calm but firm. "The industry is changing. Luxury travellers want experiences that go beyond just a nice room and a fancy dinner. They want personalised services, sustainability and technology that makes their stay seamless. You're clinging to the past, and it's holding this company back." Her mother, Claire, raised an eyebrow and turned to Michael. "She's been talking about these trends for years," she said with a hint of disdain. "And yet, we're still here, still a major player in the industry. Maybe it's time to stop listening to her new age ideas." Elizabeth's eyes flicked to Matthew, who had been silent so far. He leaned forward, his smirk growing wider. "You know, Elizabeth," he said, "this is exactly why you'll never fit in here. You're always chasing the next big thing, and you'll always miss the mark. You're just not cut out for this." Her brother's words cut deep, but Elizabeth refused to let him see the effect they had on her. She had dealt with his arrogance and condescension for years, and it no longer bothered her. She had bigger things to focus on now. "I'm not here to chase trends, Matthew," she said coolly. "I'm here to save Henderson Hotels from sinking into irrelevance. This plan will work, I know it will." Michael Sr. slammed his fist onto the table, his face turning red with anger. "Enough, Elizabeth. You've made your point, but I won't stand for this. Your ideas, your so-called innovations, are nothing more than a joke. They won't work here, not in this family business. You're out of your depth." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected this level of hostility. The weight of her father's words pressed down on her, but she didn't falter. She had come too far to back down now. "I'm not out of my depth," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "You may not see it now, but these changes are necessary. The world is moving forward, and if Henderson Hotels doesn't keep up, it will get left behind. You can either adapt, or you can keep playing it safe and watch everything you've worked for fall apart." Michael stood up from the table, his eyes flashing with anger. "You're deluded, Elizabeth. You've always been deluded. I've worked my whole life to build this company, and you think you can just waltz in here and take over? This is my legacy. It's not yours." Elizabeth stood her ground, refusing to let his words sway her. "I don't need your legacy, Dad. I'm building my own." Her father's face twisted in fury. "You're crossing a line, Elizabeth. You're not part of this family anymore. If you think you can come in here and tear this company apart, you're sorely mistaken. This is a warning. You stay out of Henderson Hotels, or there will be consequences." The room fell silent, and Elizabeth could feel the weight of her father's threat hanging in the air. But rather than cowering, she stood taller. She knew this was a turning point, a defining moment in her life. Her family had made their position clear, but Elizabeth had already made up her mind. There was no turning back now. "Fine," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "I've already bought 49% of Henderson Hotels, and soon I'll own 51%. You'll see. You'll all see." As she walked out of the room, Elizabeth felt a surge of adrenaline. The battle had just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. Her family had underestimated her for too long. Now she was going to show them what she was capable of. After the explosive confrontation with her father, Elizabeth knew the time had come to push her plan into its final stages. She had already anticipated the resistance, the threats, and the bitter words. But it didn't matter. They had made their choice, and now it was her turn to make hers. In the days following the family meeting, Elizabeth didn't waste time. She had been carefully accumulating shares of Henderson Hotels for months, and the numbers were steadily climbing. She was close to securing 51% of the company's stock, a quiet but powerful victory. Her father's warning had been nothing more than a fleeting attempt to intimidate her, but Elizabeth wasn't fazed. Instead, it only strengthened her resolve. Her plan was simple: maintain her stealthy acquisition of shares, wait for the right moment, and then strike. The company's upcoming Henderson Hotels Excellence Awards was that moment, the perfect opportunity for her to reveal her true intentions. It would be a night of celebration, a night when her family would be expecting nothing more than a few congratulatory speeches and the usual pomp and circumstance. But what they didn't know was that this would be the night everything changed. She had carefully orchestrated every detail. The final purchase of stock was scheduled to go through during the awards ceremony itself. The shares would push her ownership to 51%, officially giving her control of the company. The press had been alerted to the event, and her team was preparing the press releases that would go live the moment the transfer was completed. Elizabeth's mind raced with anticipation. She had imagined this moment for years, dreamed of it even. She had built an empire, faced countless obstacles, and now it was finally time to take what was rightfully hers. The week leading up to the awards was a blur of final preparations, meetings with her legal team, and covert coordination with her financial advisors. As much as she wanted to be at the forefront of it all, Elizabeth made sure to keep a low profile. Her family still saw her as the outsider, the failure. They had no idea how far along her plans had come. They were walking straight into the trap she had laid for them. On the night of the awards, Elizabeth was calm and collected. She arrived at Henderson Grand in a tailored dress that exuded both power and elegance. Her family was already there, mingling with the industry's elite, completely unaware that everything they knew was about to change. As she walked into the ballroom, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. She had always been an outsider in her family's world, but tonight that would change. Elizabeth made her way to the VIP section, where her parents and brother were seated. They barely acknowledged her, but that was nothing new. They were too busy basking in their own self-importance. Her father, Michael Sr., was busy giving a speech about the company's legacy, proudly reminiscing about the old days when Henderson Hotels was the epitome of luxury. To him, those days were golden, untouchable, a symbol of everything that had made the family successful. But Elizabeth knew the truth. Henderson Hotels was struggling. It had been for years, and they were too blind to see it. As her father continued, Elizabeth pulled out her phone and checked the latest stock update. The final purchase had gone through. She now owned 51% of Henderson Hotels. The takeover was complete. She felt a surge of satisfaction, but there was no time to dwell on it. The real show was about to begin. As the night wore on, the room filled with the usual chatter and laughter. Matthew, ever the golden child, was receiving applause for his so-called innovations in the company. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. He had done little more than rearrange a few menus while she had transformed an entire industry. Yet he was still the one getting all the accolades. She wondered how he would react when he learned who had truly been the driving force behind his success. Then the moment arrived. The awards ceremony was in full swing, and the focus turned to the most anticipated announcement of the evening, the Innovation in Hospitality Award. Everyone in the room knew that Matthew was the favourite to win. He had done just enough to earn the title, and his presence as a visionary was expected to be the highlight of the night. But Elizabeth knew that the night was not about Matthew, it was about her. As the host announced the winner and Matthew stood to accept the award, Elizabeth stood up from her seat, her heart pounding with excitement. She made her way to the stage, her movements smooth and deliberate. Her family's eyes followed her, confused by her sudden appearance. The tension in the room was palpable. Before Matthew could even reach the podium, Elizabeth stepped forward. She smiled, the anticipation building. The crowd quieted as they realised something was about to change. "Good evening, everyone," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but carrying across the room. "I'd like to take a moment to address something important." She pulled up her phone and swiped across the screen. The room's giant screens flickered, and the outdated Henderson Hotels logo dissolved into a sleek, modern design, the new face of the company. The room erupted in whispers, but Elizabeth wasn't done yet. "As of tonight, I am the majority shareholder of Henderson Hotels. I now own 51% of the company. The changes I've been proposing will begin immediately, and it's time to take this company into the future." Her family's faces turned pale as the realization dawned on them. Matthew's mouth hung open, and her father's expression went from confusion to anger. They had no idea what had just happened, but Elizabeth did. She had executed her plan flawlessly, and Henderson Hotels would never be the same. As her family struggled to comprehend the turn of events, Elizabeth smiled, knowing that her reign was just beginning. The night of the Henderson Hotels Excellence Awards was a carefully orchestrated affair. The ballroom was filled with the industry's elite, investors, partners, and media, all gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be the pinnacle of the Henderson legacy. Elizabeth stood near the back of the room, blending into the shadows, her gaze fixed on her family at the front. Matthew, her brother, stood proudly beside their parents as the master of ceremonies continued to heap praise on him. The award for innovation in hospitality was about to be presented, and everyone knew Matthew would be the recipient. His contributions to the family business were, at best, superficial. A few tweaks to the minibar offerings, some changes to the decor, but nothing truly groundbreaking. Yet here he was, basking in the attention, as if he were the saviour of Henderson Hotels. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel the irony of it all. The man who had spent years pretending to be an innovator was about to be celebrated for doing the bare minimum. She had revolutionized the industry, completely reshaping what luxury hospitality could look like, but instead of receiving praise, she had been cast aside, relegated to the position of the family's outcast. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., was all smiles as he patted Matthew on the back, clearly thrilled that his son would receive yet another accolade. "Matthew's done it again," Michael boomed, his voice carrying over the applause. "He's bringing us into the future, one small change at a time." Elizabeth's lip curled slightly, but she said nothing. She was no longer the same woman who had once fought for her place in this family. Her time had come, and she wasn't going to sit idly by while Matthew basked in undeserved praise. As the applause died down and the host prepared to announce Matthew as the winner, Elizabeth felt the familiar buzz of her phone in her pocket. She glanced down quickly. "The final purchase has been completed. You now own 51% of Henderson Hotels." Her heart raced for a moment. The plan was in motion. The moment she had waited for was finally here. She slowly made her way toward the stage, her footsteps purposeful and deliberate. As she approached the front of the room, the attention of the guests shifted to her. Some were surprised to see her standing, but no one knew the significance of her presence just yet. Matthew was still standing proudly at the podium, flashing his award-winning smile as the crowd clapped. He didn't see her coming, didn't even notice until she reached the microphone. "Excuse me, Matthew," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the noise, "but I believe it's time to address something that's been long overdue." The crowd fell silent, unsure of what was happening. Matthew blinked in surprise, and his smile faltered slightly as he saw his sister standing before him. The moment was electric with tension, and the family's facade of unity began to crack. "Tonight," Elizabeth continued, "I'm here to talk about Henderson Hotels. This company, this legacy, has been built on tradition, yes, but it's also at a crossroads. You've been celebrating small changes, but I've been working on something much bigger, something that's going to shape the future of this company for years to come." She paused, letting her words sink in. Matthew's expression shifted from confusion to frustration. He knew something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "I've been quietly acquiring shares in Henderson Hotels," Elizabeth continued, her voice steady and controlled, "for months now. And tonight, I've reached the final milestone." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but Elizabeth raised her hand to silence them. Her next words were deliberate. "I now own 51% of Henderson Hotels," she announced, her words ringing out clear and strong in the room. "I have just taken control of the company." The room went still, as if time itself had frozen. Her family's faces drained of colour. Michael and Claire stared at her, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Matthew stood frozen, his mouth agape, unable to process what was happening. Elizabeth met their stunned gazes with calm resolve. "For years, you've all dismissed me," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "For years you've told me that I didn't understand this business, that my ideas were too modern and out of touch. Well, the truth is, Henderson Hotels was never going to survive unless it changed, and now I'm here to make that change." She turned to face the audience, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This isn't just about a takeover. This is about saving a legacy that's been drowning in outdated practices. This company can be great again, but it needs to evolve, and I'm the one who's going to lead it into the future." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint shuffle of feet as the guests shifted uncomfortably. Elizabeth's gaze remained unwavering as she turned back to her family. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Michael stood up, his face reddening with rage. "Elizabeth," he spat, his voice trembling with anger, "this is a betrayal. You've undermined everything we've worked for. You think you can just come in here and take over?" Elizabeth didn't flinch. "I didn't take over, Dad. You gave it to me. You ignored everything I tried to tell you, and now you've handed me the reins. I didn't need your permission, and I don't need your approval. This company is mine now." Matthew stepped forward, his arrogance quickly replaced with panic. "You can't do this, Elizabeth. You don't understand what you're doing. This company was built on tradition, not tech gimmicks." Elizabeth met his eyes, her voice low and steady. "You were never part of the future, Matthew. You were just too busy polishing the past." With that, Elizabeth turned away from the stage, walking toward the back of the room where her legal team was waiting. The battle was over before it had even started. As her family struggled to comprehend the events that had unfolded, Elizabeth knew that this was only the beginning. The real work was just beginning, and Henderson Hotels would be better for it. The room had fallen silent after Elizabeth's revelation, but the shock was palpable, suffocating in its weight. Every person in the ballroom had heard her words, and the impact was immediate. No one knew what to say, and for a few moments it felt like the entire world had stopped spinning. Michael Sullivan Sr. was the first to react. His face had gone from pale to crimson in an instant, his eyes wide with disbelief. He sputtered, unable to form a coherent sentence at first. You can't do this," he finally stammered, the anger in his voice thick with disbelief. "You can't just come in here and take what's ours." Elizabeth watched him, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The moment her family would finally see the consequences of their refusal to acknowledge her abilities, her ideas, and her vision. "You gave it to me, Dad," Elizabeth said evenly, her voice unwavering. "You turned a blind eye to everything I did. You let this company slip into decline because you refused to adapt. I've been here the whole time, watching as you ran Henderson Hotels into the ground, and now it's mine." Her father's face turned darker with rage, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about the future of the company, and that future was in her hands. Matthew stepped forward, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "This is insane. You can't just take over like this. This is our company, Elizabeth. You don't understand what you're doing." Elizabeth let out a short, humourless laugh. "You've been telling me that for years, Matthew. You've been telling me I don't understand. But the truth is, Henderson Hotels was never going to survive with you at the helm. You've done nothing but push the company further into the ground." As Matthew opened his mouth to protest again, Elizabeth pressed a button on her phone. Instantly, the massive screens around the room flickered to life, displaying real-time financial data, graphs, figures and charts that told the harsh truth about Henderson's decline. The numbers didn't lie. Henderson Hotels had lost 40% of its market share in the last year alone. Occupancy rates were down, customer satisfaction had plummeted, and several properties were now at risk of losing their prestigious 5-star status. The most damning of all, the company had failed multiple quality inspections in key locations. The room gasped as the data continued to pour in. A few whispers spread across the crowd, followed by stunned silence. This was the reality of the company her family had fought to protect for generations. The legacy was crumbling, and they had failed to see it until now. "This is what you've been protecting," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the screens. "These are the numbers you didn't want to face. The company has been in free fall for months. And yet you still thought it was enough to hang on to tradition, to pretend like everything was fine." Her mother, Claire, looked as though she might faint. Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass of champagne, but the shaking only made her grip worse. "Elizabeth, you can't. This isn't right. This is our company. You have no right to do this." Elizabeth met her mother's gaze with a quiet intensity. "I have every right, Mom. I own 51% of it. I'm the majority shareholder now, and you didn't even see it coming." The realization hit them all at once. Their grip on Henderson Hotels had slipped. Elizabeth was in control now, and they were powerless. As Michael tried to steady himself, he turned to the gathered board members, his voice trembling with frustration. "You can't let this happen. You can't let her destroy everything we've worked for. She's a consultant, a nobody. She doesn't know how to run a business like this." But the board members weren't looking at Michael anymore. Their eyes were on the screens, on the data, on the undeniable truth that Elizabeth had shown them. One by one, their faces shifted, from disbelief to realization, from shock to understanding. Elizabeth took a deep breath, letting the silence linger for a moment before she spoke again. "You had your chance to evolve. You had your chance to change, but you refused. Now, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to take this company to places you never even dreamed of." Her father stood up, his body trembling with rage. "You think you can just come in here with your tech-driven nonsense and take over? This company isn't a toy, Elizabeth. This is my legacy." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "No, Dad. This was your legacy," she said, pointing at the screens again. "But it's gone now. It's time for a new chapter, a better chapter, and I'm the one who's going to write it." For a brief moment, she saw her father's face crumple. The pride that had always defined him, the pride he had passed down to Matthew, was gone. And in its place there was nothing but defeat. Michael Sullivan Sr. didn't know how to respond, and neither did Matthew. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elizabeth could see the writing on the wall. Some of them were already reconsidering their loyalties. They had all seen the numbers, and they all knew which direction the company was heading. With her at the helm, there was hope. With Michael and Matthew still holding the reins, there was none. Elizabeth smiled, her victory already felt but not yet complete. The battle was won. She had gained control of Henderson Hotels, and now the real work began. It would take time, but she would rebuild the company, revitalize its legacy, and prove to her family that she was the true architect of its future. But that was a story for another day. Tonight was about taking back what had always been hers. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating, as Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, the weight of her newfound power hanging heavy in the air. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., and her brother Matthew were still processing the events of the past few days, unable to grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. The family meeting was supposed to be a calm discussion about the future of Henderson Hotels, but it had quickly escalated into a confrontation that neither side could avoid any longer. Michael slammed his fist on the table, his voice shaking with rage. "I can't believe you did this, Elizabeth. You've gone behind our backs, destroyed everything we've worked for, and now you're pretending like you've done the right thing. You think this is the solution? You're tearing apart the legacy of this family." Elizabeth remained calm, her posture straight and confident as she faced her father. His words no longer held the sting they once did. She had heard it all before, the disapproval, the dismissive comments, the cold rejection. It was nothing new. "I didn't destroy anything, Dad," Elizabeth said, her voice firm but measured. "I saved it. Henderson Hotels was dying. You didn't see it, and neither did Matthew. You were so focused on holding on to outdated traditions that you couldn't see the writing on the wall. I've done what needed to be done. Her father's face turned crimson, and he was clearly struggling to hold back his fury. You think you're saving anything. You're ruining everything we've built. You took control of a company you've never truly understood. You're just playing at being a CEO, Elizabeth. You don't have the experience to run this business. Matthew, standing to the side, finally spoke up, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and anger. This is insane. You didn't even have the decency to tell us what you were doing. You just went behind our backs and bought up all the stock. This isn't the way to run a family business. Elizabeth turned to face her brother, her gaze cool and unwavering. She had always been the one he belittled, the one he underestimated. But now the tables had turned, and for the first time in her life, she felt nothing but satisfaction. Maybe I didn't tell you because I knew exactly how you'd react, Matthew. You've always been too busy patting yourself on the back for the most insignificant accomplishments. You think that changing the minibar snacks or rearranging the furniture is innovation. You were never the one who understood what this company needed. Matthew's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, Elizabeth saw the hurt beneath his frustration. He had always been the golden child in the family, the one who could do no wrong, while she had been cast aside as the failure. But now she was the one in control, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. I did what I had to do, Matthew, she said, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. You may have been content with your little role in the family business, but I wasn't. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself to you, to Mom and Dad, and I'm done with that. I've built something that actually works, and now Henderson Hotels is mine. Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment there was silence. Michael and Matthew both looked at her, disbelief written across their faces. The realization that the company was now hers, the company they had worked so hard to build, was sinking in. Michael finally spoke, his voice low and filled with bitterness. You really think you've won, don't you? You think that just because you have the majority of the shares, you have control of everything. But this isn't just about numbers, Elizabeth, it's about family, and you've torn that apart. Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt in her chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by the satisfaction of finally standing up for herself. She had tried for years to make her family see her worth, to make them realize that she wasn't just a consultant or a failure. Now she didn't need their approval anymore. She had proved herself in ways they couldn't even begin to understand. You're right, Dad. It's about family, Elizabeth said quietly. But you've never treated me like family. You've always pushed me aside, made me feel like I was never good enough. Well, now you see the truth. I'm not the outsider anymore. I'm the one who's going to rebuild this company, and I'm going to do it the right way. Matthew's eyes narrowed. You think this is easy? You think you can just walk in here and change everything? It's not that simple. Elizabeth stood up, her expression hardening as she faced her brother. I've already made the changes, Matthew. Henderson Hotels is already on a better path. I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I'm asking you to step aside and let me do what needs to be done. Her father's gaze shifted between her and Matthew, and for the first time Elizabeth saw something in his eyes. Resignation. He knew he had lost. They both knew it. The family legacy was no longer in their hands. It was hers now. I won't sit back and watch you destroy everything we've built, Michael said, his voice shaking with emotion. You're making a mistake. Elizabeth met his gaze and smiled, the bitterness from the years of rejection and pain melting away. I'm not destroying anything. I'm saving it. And one day, you'll see that. The family's final resistance had crumbled. The battle had been won, and Elizabeth knew that her journey was far from over. There was still much to do, changes to implement, relationships to mend, and obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from the expectations, free from the rejection, and free from the shadow of her family's legacy. She had claimed her place in the world, and now it was her turn to shape the future. The morning after the confrontation, Elizabeth sat in her new office, gazing out over the city with a sense of calm certainty. She had spent years fighting for her place in this family, but now she was in control of Henderson Hotels and everything was about to change. The tension between her and her family was still fresh, but Elizabeth wasn't bothered by it. It was the moment she had been waiting for. Her father's fury, her brother's disbelief, it all meant nothing anymore. The company was hers, and now she was going to reshape it into something better, something the industry had never seen before. As she sat at her desk, a message popped up on her screen. It was from Sophia, her trusted advisor at Sullivan Global. "Elizabeth, we've reviewed the new proposals and we're ready to roll them out. Are you sure you're ready for this? We can start implementing the restructuring plan tomorrow." Elizabeth smiled, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her desk. She was ready. It was time to push forward, and nothing was going to stand in her way. She typed a quick reply. "Yes, let's start today. The future of Henderson Hotels starts now." The restructuring of Henderson Hotels would be sweeping. Elizabeth had already begun drafting a new organisational structure, one that was leaner, more efficient, and, most importantly, forward-thinking. The traditional hierarchy her father had relied on for years was outdated and slow. It needed to be dismantled. New leaders with fresh perspectives would be brought in, and technology would be integrated into every aspect of the business. AI-driven guest experiences, data analytics for better decision-making, and sustainable practices were at the heart of her vision. Henderson Hotels would no longer be the stagnant legacy brand it had once been. But the family's resistance was still strong. Elizabeth knew her father would fight her every step of the way, even though he had lost control. Michael Sr. had spent his life building the business, and the idea of handing it over to his daughter, who had always been seen as the outsider, was a bitter pill to swallow. But Elizabeth was determined. She would prove that her way was the future, and their way was the past. As she finalised the details of the restructuring plan, a sudden phone call interrupted her thoughts. It was from her lawyer. "Elizabeth," the voice on the other end said, "you need to sit down. There's something you need to hear." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" she asked, feeling a sense of unease. "It's about Matthew," her lawyer said, and Elizabeth could hear the hesitation in his voice. "There's been an audit, and we've discovered something troubling. It appears that Matthew has been siphoning funds from the company for the past year. He's been embezzling money." Elizabeth's mind raced. She knew Matthew was no saint, but embezzlement. This was more than just the usual incompetence. This was serious. Her brother, the one who had always been held up as the golden child, had been betraying the family and the company all along. It was a game changer, and Elizabeth knew it. "How much?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's significant," the lawyer replied. "We're still gathering the full details, but it looks like he's been using company funds for personal expenses, large sums diverted into offshore accounts." Elizabeth's mind was already working through the implications. This was the leverage she needed. Matthew had always been the one to criticise her, to belittle her. But now he was the one in the hot seat. The family's foundation was already shaky, but this would be the final blow. "Get me everything you have," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're going to take this to the board. This changes everything." Elizabeth hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair. For a moment she allowed herself to savour the irony of the situation. Matthew had always treated her as the failure, the one who didn't understand the business, but now he was the one who would be exposed for his corruption. The betrayal he had inflicted on the company was far worse than anything she had ever done. That afternoon, Elizabeth called an emergency board meeting. The room was filled with the usual faces, but there was a sense of tension in the air. Everyone knew that things had changed, but no one expected what was about to unfold. Elizabeth stood at the front of the room, her posture strong and confident. She had prepared herself for this moment, and now it was time to take control. "I've called this meeting because we've discovered something that cannot be ignored," she began. The board members looked at her, puzzled but attentive. We've uncovered evidence that Matthew has been embezzling funds from Henderson Hotels. The amount is substantial, and it's been going on for over a year. Gasps filled the room. Some of the board members looked at each other, clearly shocked by the revelation. Elizabeth continued, laying out the evidence in front of them, showing the records, the transactions, and the proof of Matthew's betrayal. Her father's face went pale, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw him struggle to maintain his composure. Matthew sat slumped in his chair, his expression one of utter disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. "You've been deceiving us all, Matthew," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp. "For years you've pretended to be the leader, the one who knew what was best for Henderson Hotels. But while you were playing the role of the perfect son, you were stealing from the company, from our legacy." Michael Sr. looked at his son, his face twisted with anger and disappointment. I never thought it would come to this," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I thought I raised you better." Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had been caught, and there was no escaping it. Elizabeth turned to the rest of the board. "As of today, I am restructuring the company. We cannot continue to ignore the rot that has set in. This is the final step toward making Henderson Hotels a company that is built for the future, not stuck in the past." With Matthew's actions now exposed, the family's resistance crumbled. The board voted unanimously in favour of Elizabeth's plan, and the changes she had envisioned for the company were set into motion. As the meeting adjourned, Elizabeth felt a sense of finality wash over her. She had won. Not just the battle for control, but the battle to reshape the future of Henderson Hotels. Her father's legacy was no longer in his hands. It was hers to lead, to rebuild, to take to places they had never dreamed. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time Elizabeth knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Weeks had passed since the monumental shift in Henderson Hotels. Under Elizabeth's leadership, the company had already begun showing signs of revival. The AI-driven guest experiences had increased customer satisfaction, occupancy rates were starting to climb again, and the sustainable practices she had implemented had reduced operational costs significantly. Investors, once sceptical, were now calling her a visionary, and the media had taken notice. Henderson Hotels was no longer a sinking ship, it was rising from the ashes. Yet, despite these early victories, Elizabeth couldn't ignore the lingering issues. The company was still riddled with inefficiencies. The old guard, the employees who had been loyal to her father for decades, were struggling to adapt to the changes. Many had resisted the new technology, refusing to embrace the modernization she was pushing forward. There were still systemic issues in the back office, outdated software, processes that were cumbersome, and a workforce that had grown complacent under the previous leadership. Elizabeth knew that the true work was just beginning. Her vision for Henderson Hotels wasn't just about modernizing the front-end customer experience. It was about reworking the entire company from the inside out. The restructuring had only just begun. She would have to continue to root out the inefficiencies, overhaul the management, and break down the culture of complacency that had taken hold in the company over the years. But as much as Elizabeth was focused on the future of Henderson Hotels, there was another issue weighing heavily on her mind: her family. The rift between them had deepened since she had taken control of the company. Her father, Michael Sullivan Sr., still hadn't fully accepted her leadership. He had retreated into silence, unable to deal with the fact that his daughter now held the reins of the family business. Matthew, her brother, had barely spoken to her since the embezzlement scandal had come to light. His arrogance had been shattered, and though he had yet to apologize, Elizabeth knew there was an unspoken understanding between them. He had lost, and she had won. But the family wasn't completely lost to her. She had received several messages from her mother, Claire, over the past few weeks, all of them tentative attempts at reconciliation. At first, Elizabeth had ignored them, too focused on the task at hand. But now, after seeing the early success of her changes to Henderson Hotels, she was starting to consider the possibility of mending the fractured bonds with her family. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest reports, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. "Elizabeth, I think it's time we talked. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. Let's meet for lunch tomorrow." Elizabeth stared at the message for a moment, the weight of it settling over her. Her mother had always been the one to pull strings behind the scenes, keeping the family together when things fell apart. Now it seemed like she was reaching out, perhaps trying to bridge the divide. Elizabeth wasn't sure if she was ready for that, but she also knew it was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. It was a chance to begin healing, even if it meant facing the unresolved pain that had always existed between them. The next day, Elizabeth met her mother at a quiet cafe near Henderson Grand. Claire was already sitting at a table, sipping a cup of tea. She looked older than Elizabeth remembered, her face lined with the years of managing a family business that was crumbling under the weight of tradition. "Mom," Elizabeth said softly as she sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure if you really wanted to talk." Claire looked at her, her eyes softening. "I know I've been hard on you, Elizabeth. For a long time I didn't see it, didn't see what you were trying to do. I was too focused on keeping everything the same. But now, seeing how Henderson Hotels is starting to come back, I see that I was wrong. I see that you had the right vision all along." Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. She had wanted her mother to see her potential for so long, but now it felt like too little, too late. Yet despite the lingering bitterness, she could hear the sincerity in her mother's voice. "I'm glad you see that now," Elizabeth replied. "But it wasn't just about making the company better, Mom. It was about me. It was about proving that I could do it, proving that I wasn't just a failure in your eyes." Claire reached across the table and took her hand. "I never meant to make you feel like a failure, Elizabeth. I thought I knew what was best for the company. I thought I knew how to protect our legacy. But I see now that I've held on to the past for too long. And you were right to push for change. You're not a failure, sweetheart. You're a leader, and I'm proud of you." The words were like a balm to the old wounds, but they didn't heal them completely. Elizabeth wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive her mother for the years of dismissal, the constant undermining of her abilities, but she was willing to try for the sake of the family and the company that had now become her responsibility. "I've made a lot of changes already, but there's still a long way to go," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "I need your help, Mum. I can't do this alone." Claire nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "You have it, Elizabeth. You've always had it." For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. The path to healing was long, but it was possible. The changes she had made to Henderson Hotels were just the beginning, and now, with her mother's support, she felt like she could truly lead the company into a new era. As she left the cafe, Elizabeth knew that there were still many obstacles ahead. There was still much work to be done with her father and Matthew, and the company had its challenges. But now, more than ever, she felt ready. Henderson Hotels would thrive, and so would her family, even if it meant starting from scratch. Her future was bright, and she was finally in control of it. As Elizabeth sat at the head of the table in the sleek, modern boardroom of Henderson Hotels, the weight of her newfound responsibility settled comfortably on her shoulders. The company, once struggling, was now showing signs of resilience under her leadership. The restructuring was moving forward with precision, and investors were impressed with the results. Customer satisfaction was on the rise, occupancy rates were climbing, and the company's profits were improving. But despite these triumphs, Elizabeth couldn't shake the lingering tension that existed between her and her family. Her relationship with her parents had started to thaw, but it was far from perfect. She had spent so many years being dismissed by them, being told she wasn't good enough, that the wounds didn't heal overnight. Her mother's words of pride had meant a great deal to Elizabeth, but they didn't erase the years of rejection. And while she had long ago come to terms with her father's inability to see her potential, the scars remained. Even though she now controlled Henderson Hotels, Elizabeth couldn't allow herself to forget the past. She had to keep moving forward, but she also had to protect herself. The family that had once cast her aside wasn't entitled to the same trust anymore. Elizabeth couldn't afford to let them back into her life without boundaries. She was in control now, but that control had come at a steep cost. Despite this, Elizabeth had opened herself up more to her family. She had allowed her mother back into her life, accepting the occasional lunch or meeting to discuss the future of the company. But there was always a part of her that remained distant, a part of her that reminded herself to be cautious. The betrayal, the years of being overlooked couldn't be erased in a few weeks. Matthew, on the other hand, remained a painful reminder of everything she had fought against. After the embezzlement scandal, he had been pushed out of the family business, but the damage to their relationship was irreparable. He had never apologised for his actions, and even though Elizabeth had won, she didn't feel victorious when it came to him. The truth was, she didn't expect him to change. She didn't expect him to ever see her as anything other than the failure he had always believed her to be. As much as she had longed for her family's approval, Elizabeth knew now that she didn't need it. She had built something of her own, something far more important than the empty praise she had once craved. Sullivan Global was thriving, and she was leading it with a level of confidence that came from years of hard work and struggle. It wasn't just about the hotel empire. It was about proving to herself that she could succeed without relying on anyone's approval. Yet, she couldn't completely close herself off. Her mother had started reaching out more, calling her occasionally to discuss the business, even asking for Elizabeth's advice. It was the start of a new dynamic, one that was based on mutual respect, rather than the old patterns of dismissal and competition. But Elizabeth knew better than to let her guard down entirely. She was still the same person who had been pushed aside for years. And while things were changing, they weren't completely healed. One evening, as Elizabeth was reviewing the latest quarterly report, she received a call from her mother. It was one of the rare times Claire had called without an agenda. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Hi, Elizabeth," her mother said, her voice softer than usual. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I've seen the changes you've made to the company, and I can see that you're doing what's best for Henderson Hotels. I know I didn't always support you, but I want you to know that I see the woman you've become." Elizabeth's chest tightened at the words, the sincerity in her mother's voice catching her off guard. It wasn't the first time Claire had acknowledged her success, but it was the first time it felt real, like an apology without the words. "Thank you, Mum," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady but emotionally charged. "It means a lot to hear you say that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, the kind that only comes when two people finally understand each other after years of miscommunication. But for Elizabeth, that understanding didn't come without its cost. "I'm still figuring it all out," Elizabeth added, breaking the silence. "The company, my own feelings, it's not easy. But I'm moving forward. I can't go back to the way things were." Her mother's response was gentle. "I understand, and I'm here if you ever need me." The conversation ended on a softer note, and Elizabeth felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. But even as the call ended, she knew that her journey wasn't over. Henderson Hotels was only beginning its transformation, and she had to keep pushing forward. The company needed her vision, but she needed to remain strong and focused. The past had shaped her, but it wouldn't dictate her future. As she sat back in her chair, looking out at the city below, Elizabeth knew that she had finally come into her own. The family that had once dismissed her now had to face the woman she had become. but she wouldn't be defined by their approval or disapproval. She was forging her own path, and she was going to make sure it was one that would lead to lasting success, not just for Henderson Hotels, but for herself. The future was hers to shape, and no one, not even her family, could take that away from her.